like to welcome you on behalf of the Shared Reading, Shared Thoughts Committee. My name is Lisa Seal. I am the project manager for Affluenza, and I'm also an English professor here on campus. I'll be introducing our panelists and also just introducing you to the event. This is the second event in our year-long series of events related to Affluenza. We've had very lovely coverage in the Wausau Daily Herald and on radio and television stations, but of course you may recognize this book. Hope you'll have a chance to read it. We do have a website, and we welcome you to visit that website. We have a blog on the website, and if you'd like to, after tonight's events, post some ideas, please feel free to do so. You would just have to go to the campus website, which is www.uwmc.uwc.edu, and if that's too hard, just Google UW Marathon County, and we're right on the main website. I'd like to thank our sponsors. We have a number, and they are very generous community sponsors as well as statewide sponsors and UWMC sponsors. These include the North Central Health Protection Plan Fund of the Community Foundation of North Central Wisconsin, the B.A. and Esther Greenheck Foundation, the Harvey Nelson Charitable Trust, the Clyde F. Schlueter Foundation, UWMC Foundation, SLIC, which is the UWMC Student Life and Interest Committee, and the Wisconsin Public Television. We also have community partnerships with the Wausau Daily Herald and also with the Marathon County Public Library. Some of you may be involved in the book discussion group. We had two in September, and there are two coming up, October 20th and 27th, if you're interested in that. Our format for tonight, we will have our panelists speak. That will be followed by a question and answer period. Two of our ambassadors will be roving the audience with microphones, and we'll give you a chance to interact with our panelists. We also have some evaluation forms which were distributed at the beginning when you came in. We'll have a box there at the exit for you to drop that, and want to say thank you in advance. There is a reception that will be following and in the terrace room, which we'd like to all invite you to, and you'll have a chance to interact more with the panelists and with each other. Tonight we'll be talking about overconsumption, its effects on individuals, children, and families. One of the things perhaps we don't think about enough when we talk about overconsumption is how much is over, how much is too much. We all know we consume a great deal, but we don't ever pause perhaps to think quite in as much detail as we might what over means. I thought I would then just read a paragraph from Affluenza. This is from the second edition, so the date is 2005. In each of the past 8 years, more Americans have declared personal bankruptcy than graduated from college. Our annual production of solid waste would fill a convoy of garbage trucks stretching halfway to the moon. We have twice as many shopping centers as high schools. We now work more hours each year than do the citizens of any other industrial country, including Japan. Though we constitute only 4.7% of the Earth's people, we account for 25% of its global warming greenhouse gas emissions. 95% of our workers say they wish they could spend more time with their families. 40% of our lakes and streams are too polluted for swimming or fishing. A CEO now earns 475 times as much as the average worker, a tenfold increase since 1980. And since 1950, Americans have used up more resources than everyone who ever lived on Earth before then. Well, I'm hoping that our panelists will help us to think about how these national trends affect us in our daily lives. And I'd like now just to introduce each panelist, and we'll turn it over to the panelists after the introductions. Our first panelist is Liz Fremer. She is from the Center for a New American Dream in Washington, D.C. It's a national nonprofit center which helps Americans consume responsibly to protect the environment, enhance quality of life, and promote social justice. Liz Fremer holds the BA in Environmental Science and International Studies from Washington University in St. Louis. She'll be speaking about how consumerism impacts our children, and she'll have tips for parents and also community members. Liz will be followed by Holly Hassel, who is a UWMC assistant professor in the Department of English. She holds a PhD in American Literature from the University of Nebraska, and she will be speaking about consumerism in American literature. Holly will be followed by Greg Peter from UW-Fox Valley, where he is an assistant professor of sociology. He holds a PhD in sociology from Iowa State University, and he'll be speaking about school lunch programs and kids' diets. Greg will be followed by Rita Straub. She is a retired UW Extension Associate Professor in the Department of Family Development. She has a Master of Science, Family and Consumer Sciences, and she will be speaking about stressors on family life. And last, John Houchins, UWMC Associate Professor of Business and Economics. He holds the MBA from UW Oshkosh. He will be speaking about the effects of credit card debt on families. Well, I'd like to welcome all of our panelists and say a big thank you to them and to you for turning out. Here we go, Liz.
I want to get a quick thumbs up from Jim in the back. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great, thanks. So I wanted to start with the concept that here in America, we're raising a very interesting new breed of children, ones who are more likely to recognize a portrait of Ronald McDonald than Ronald Reagan, and ones better able to recite the top 10 product jingles than the first 10 amendments to our Constitution. But it hasn't always been that way. How did we get to this place of over-commercializing our nation's most vulnerable segment of the population? The picture of marketing to children has changed drastically over the last half a century. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, advertisers had very little direct access to children. Their main venue for marketing was through television, and kids spent much less time parked in front of TV sets than they do today. Not only that, but advertisers were very strictly regulated. There were guidelines in place as to how much of the content of each commercial could contain fantasy or surreal portrayals of products or how kids might use them. TV stars were strictly forbidden from acting as spokespeople, and special effects and marketing strategies were far less advanced than they are today. During those 3 decades, companies often went the route of marketing children's products to mothers, following a mother as gatekeeper protocol. Companies played to the nutritional or social value of products, and other aspects centered around the ways products would benefit kids. Then in the 1990s, kids started spending more time in front of the TV and more time alone than any other previous generation. Increased time in front of the TV for this demographic led to a boom in kid-centered programming, which then led to this growing audience grabbing advertisers' attention as a target. With the rise of stations like Nickelodeon and MTV came a major shift in advertising. Companies no longer felt the need to filter products through parents. They decided to go directly to the end user, kids. And kids proved to ad execs the gamble was worth it. In 1989, the purchasing power of kids aged 4 to 12 accounted for $6.1 billion a year in spending. By 1997, not even 10 years later, that number had skyrocketed to a whopping $23.4 billion. And those were the 4 to 12-year-olds. In 1992, the teen demographic, 12 to 19-year-olds, accounted for $170 billion a year in spending. That's about $100 a week per teen. Kids were influencing their parents to buy everything from breakfast cereals to brand name jeans to video games, and they didn't stop there. Marketers took advantage of this newfound power, dubbed kidfluence, to encourage children to weigh in on family or parental purchases as well. Commercial breaks during Saturday morning cartoons have become about much more than selling Lucky Charms or My Little Pony horses. Companies are gobbling up ad slots during children's programming to promote household goods, vacations, even family cars, knowing making a strong impression on kids could make or break their sale to parents. In 1983, companies spent a mere $100 million, and notice I say mere, on advertising and marketing directed at children. Fast forward to 2004, and in the span of just 2 decades, that number jumped to 15 billion. Now that such a huge portion of their budgets are at stake, companies have started thinking more strategically about child advertising. They're hiring teams of professionals, child psychologists, child development specialists, anthropologists, and sociologists to get inside children's thought processes to find out what makes them tick, and more importantly, what makes them buy. These days, multiple national and international conferences are held where these professionals pool resources and knowledge and trade insider tips to dissecting the child market. Companies have moved beyond their typical marketing formulae of focusing on product attributes and gender-rooted stereotypes to make symbolic appeals to American children. Companies aren't selling sneakers or day planners. They're selling happiness in the form of social status. Marketing to children has become a race to constantly redefine what it means to be cool. It has become almost eerily simple for these marketers to reach the children of America. For starters, they have the time-tested medium of television advertising. Over 60% of our nation's youth between the ages of 8 and 18 years old have a television set in their own bedroom. For 2 to 7-year-olds, that statistic is just above 30%. The average American child views about 40,000 commercials a year on television alone. As we all know, marketing now extends well beyond the confines of television as well. As technology evolves, so do new marketing techniques. Marketing can now be seen in the form of event and building sponsorship, internet ads and contests, even peer-to-peer child ambassador programs. The St. Louis Zoo, for instance, boasts the Anheuser-Busch Hippo Harbor. And college bowl games, once focused on showcasing athletic prowess, are now vehicles for promoting Tostitos. Meanwhile, countless websites lure children with online contests and games promoting online play and creativity, all the while subtly or not so subtly showcasing brand name goods and mining valuable data on children's product preferences. The internet especially has meant direct, real-time access to children for marketers without the hassle of forming focus groups or garnering parents' consent. Perhaps the most egregious of the corporate world's offenses in marketing to children is their intrusion into our nation's public education system. Advertising has penetrated our school systems through exclusive pouring contracts for soda, corporate sponsorship of new classrooms, product insertion in textbooks, school supply giveaways such as brand-laden book covers, and quote-unquote free classroom devices such as slide projectors or computers in exchange for companies' ability to constantly display banner ads on such devices or track students' online activity. Advertising within schools is especially dangerous, as studies have shown even children who recognize the underlying intention of advertisements in normal settings will internalize marketing within school walls more as a presentation of information rather than a sales pitch, because they trust that information gleaned from within their learning institutions is inherently more unbiased. The difference between advertising in schools as opposed to doing so on television or the internet, is the captive audience aspect. While parents can limit television viewing or students can walk away from a computer, marketing within schools takes advantage of our nation's compulsory attendance rules to guarantee that kids will be receiving the sales pitch, whether they wish to or not. One of the many offenders in the realm of school marketing under the guise of technology donation is Channel One. This program offers schools the chance to get a deal on television equipment for their classrooms in exchange for the schools promising during school airings of the channel's 10-minute newscast, which happens to include 2 minutes each day of paid advertisements. Channel One is second to only the Super Bowl in audience size. When you look at the numbers, this deal, which promises to be so beneficial for our classrooms and students, doesn't quite add up. While it promises major savings on expensive electronic equipment, those 10 minutes a day of broadcasting add up to 6 full days of lost instructional time. That's about $2 billion of taxpayer money, which means of that total, American citizens are paying about $300 million a year for our kids to watch ads for everything from junk food to soft drinks to video games and Hollywood movies. So what does this onslaught of marketing mean for our nation's youth? As the book Affluenza and the panelists here today will address and are presenting, this trend has solemn consequences for our children and our society as a whole. Evidence is mounting that marketing to children is harmful to their physical, mental, social, and emotional well-being. Since 1980, obesity rates among children have doubled. Within the teen population, they've tripled. Along with the rise of obesity has come a drastic rise in weight-related diseases such as type 2 diabetes and hypertension. Within the same category of food obsessions and body image concerns, eating disorders are proliferating at much higher rates and evident at much earlier ages. Along with overconsumption of food, clothes, and toys, we've also seen a rise in consumption of substances such as cigarettes, drugs, and alcohol. Even with the elimination of powerful icons such as Joe Camel and the Marlboro Man, and the increase in public awareness of dangers of smoking, more than 2,000 children and teens take up smoking every day. Every day. A third of them will die of smoking-related causes. The more marketers push their ever-evolving envelope of what's trendy, the more children strive to possess these materialistic keys to being cool. Ad agencies frequently use children one age group older than their targeted demographic because adopting more mature styles and practices is put forth as a highly desirable quality. Kids are being encouraged to act beyond their years, sometimes in extremely sexualized ways, preventing them from basking in their childhood. In the 1980s, for an example, G.I. Joe was marketed to boys 11 to 14 years old, and 17 magazine targeted girls around 16. Now, 8-year-old boys, as opposed to the 11 to 14-year-olds, say that G.I. Joe is too babyish for them to play with. And 17 magazine, their target audience, 11 to 12-year-old girls. A study compiling information on favorite ads from young boys found that the 8-year-olds' favorite ad, not Army figures, not G.I. Joe, not Legos, not Xbox, not Nike, Budweiser. Budweiser. Your 8-year-old likes Budweiser. Today's average young person between the ages of 9 and 17 scores as high on anxiety scales as children who were admitted to clinics for psychiatric disorders in the 50s. Popularity of products rise, as do prices, creating extra financial stresses for kids and their families, yet emotional satisfaction derived from these goods does not rise in correspondence. The signals of this downward spiral beg the question, what are we to do as parents, community members, and concerned citizens? There are the simple answers. You can limit your child's TV exposure or utilize mostly recorded commercial-free programs for entertainment. You can also bring television sets and computers out of kids' bedrooms and into community spaces in the home where you can monitor them better. The key for parents is to recognize and portray that protecting your kids from commercial influences does not have to mean depriving them or playing ad patrol. Creating a healthier environment for your child simply means having your family embrace healthier practices as a unit. Realize that no matter how many boundaries you set at home, marketing will find its way to your child's life, at school, through friends, in other interactions. So equip them to stand up against it. Have conversations with them about marketing, how it works, what companies are trying to do, and why, so they better understand it when it stares them in the face. Have open conversations about family values, so that your kids can see how commercialism does or doesn't fit into their own life and values. Keep in mind that companies are doing their best to portray adults as boring spoil sports. They are trying to drive a wedge between you and your children. It's an us against them. We're having fun and buying things, and they want quiet and peace. There are plenty of things you can do to prove them wrong. Plan regular family activities such as game nights, hikes, craft projects, baking nights, whatever you and your family members enjoy. The sheer act of doing positive things together outside of commercial environments helps kids establish a strong sense of self beyond a materialistic label. Another avenue for combating commercialism is to explore your religious beliefs and bring the holidays back to their origins and the family and communal aspects rather than the giving and receiving of gifts. For parents or teachers who want to see reform happen within their schools, a great place to start is with a current state analysis. Does your school have contracts with soda companies? Do they carry Channel 1? Do they use corporate-sponsored materials in their curricula? Other parents, teachers, school administrators can prove to be strong allies when you're working to get marketing out of your school or prevent it from entering. There are many examples of grassroots organizations working against things such as Channel 1, Coke or Pepsi pouring contracts, and other sources of marketing in schools. If you saw, there was a booklet outside on the table. It's called Tips for Parenting in a Commercial Culture. This is from Center for New American Dream, and it takes information from a lot of different academic sources and other studies and really condenses it into a form that you can use. You can read about these different topics and in the back find out about different groups that work to alleviate these problems. If you're not a parent or direct caregiver or somebody involved in schools, there are other great ways to get involved. There are advocacy groups out there that are always looking for volunteers to help them do public outreach and education. Simple thing like writing a letter or an op-ed for your local paper that just brings the issue to the limelight is a great example of something that you can do. Also, working towards restrictions at a local level within your own school system or within your local municipality to enact protections for students and children against marketing is a great way to then hopefully influence state and national government agencies to take notice and hopefully do something about this on a larger scale. I'm running out of time, so I will wrap up with the fact that we really, as a society, have strayed from this idea that it takes a village to raise a child. And that's the most important thing I want you to take away, is that no matter what your role, whether you have children, whether you work with children, whether you're just concerned about overconsumption in general and where it starts in youth, anything you can do to help the cause and get involved will help immensely.
Thank you very much, Liz. We're turning now to Holly Hassel.
I was asked to talk about a cultural context for consumerism, and this provided some really great contemporary statistics about the effect of affluenza or consumerism today. And what I want to talk about today is, through the history of American literature, look at the ways that even though we think and we can see from all these statistics that consumerism or overconsumption have had a significant impact on our culture today, consumerism and commodity culture and what we could even call affluenza have always been present in American culture, and for as long as there's been overconsumption, writers have been talking about it and criticizing it. So my talk is called Consumerism in the Great American Novel. The book selected for UWMC's Shared Reading, Shared Thoughts this year, Affluenza, argues that the modern-day United States is in the throes of the age of affluenza. They define the disease, as they call it, as a painful, contagious, socially transmitted condition of overload, debt, anxiety, and waste, resulting from the dogged pursuit of more, end quote. The authors believe that consumerism is destructive, alienating, and frankly, depressing, literally. However, the authors are not the first to observe this, and the goal of my presentation today is to provide a very brief discussion of how some American writers have commented on consumerism throughout the 20th century, and to provide a literary context for the discussion of affluenza. To illustrate these literary critiques of consumerism, I've chosen several great American novels of the 20th century. That term, the great American novel, emerged in the late 19th century in an article in The Nation as a response to the call for the creation of a national literature on par with the literary identity already established by English writers. Since that time, in the last 100 years, American writers have responded to that call to create a body of literature specific to the US with enthusiasm. And I think it is significant that so many of these great American novels find, at least in part, the American obsession with consumerism and its related symptom, social alienation and disconnection, a rich theme for their work. No pun intended. I guess kind of intended. Okay. As the book Affluenza documents, the turn of the 20th century marks a shift in conspicuous consumption, or consumption as a status marker. And the book, Edith Wharton's book, The House of Mirth, reflected this new concern. Wharton's novel, published in 1905, is the story of Lily Bart, a beautiful but penniless woman of old money heritage who hovers toward the age of unmarriageability, 29. The House of Mirth, like much of the New York writer's work, is a scathing social critique of the shallowness and vanities of the New York social circuit. Writer Irving Howe said that Wharton's novels could be characterized as, quote, tough-spirited, fierce, and abrasive satires of the barbaric Philistinism she felt to be settling upon American society, end quote. She was particularly concerned with the damaging power of wealth. But Wharton's novel was published before the age of excess of the 1920s, and the rising stock market and economic boom of that era gave rise to some of the more notable critiques of consumerism, some of which I think you will be familiar with. Perhaps better known than Wharton is F. Scott Fitzgerald's 1925 novel, The Great Gatsby, which, like much of his work, was preoccupied with the excesses of the jazz age and the increasing emptiness of mass culture. In the novel, Fitzgerald, like many other writers of this era, critiques the corrupted American dream, which to the author originally meant the values of discovery, individualism, the pursuit of happiness, but in his mind had metamorphosed into crass commercialism, greed, materialism, privilege, and a kind of callous disregard for others. You can see how this echoes our contemporary concerns 80 years ago. Fitzgerald lamented the loss of traditional values like love and loyalty, represented by the title character, whose death is brought about because of actions based on those very values. When Gatsby lies and takes responsibility for a murder he did not commit, he himself is the victim of a revenge killing, speaking to Fitzgerald's belief that the idealism and virtues that Gatsby represents cannot successfully exist in a world corrupted by material wealth. Even more critical of the era of excess, John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, perhaps his best-known work, is a social protest novel about the Joad family, Oklahoma farmers forced to migrate west in the midst of the Dust Bowl, which plunges them into poverty. Though capitalism is Steinbeck's target more than widespread affluenza or excess consumerism on the part of individuals, the novel's critique bears relevance to our current discussion of overconsumption. Steinbeck's novel targets corporate agriculture and the economic system that oppresses the poor rather than the actions of individuals. He's far more disillusioned by institutions than by individual actions. The novel is characterized by, as McWilliams and McWilliams write, quote, savage anger at the impersonal process that uproots men from the land and rapes it, substituting rattletraps and highways for place and kindred. Like the authors of Affluenza, Steinbeck saw the unchecked growth of powerful private interest groups and large-scale commercial exploitation of the land as contrary to the value of what critic Daniel Aaron called neighborly interdependence. Well, many readers and politicians called it communism, and the book was banned widely because of it. Wrong order. No, wait. Less a social protest and more a meditation on the American spirit, Jack Kerouac's 1957 hymn to the American highway, On the Road, is considered by some to be the quintessential great American novel. It's less a critique of consumerism than a celebration of anti-consumerism. One critic has noted that the novel is, quote, the story of the narrator's search for religious truth and for values more profound than those embraced by most of mid-20th century America, consumerism, conformity, etc. But Kerouac himself says it better in a dialogue between the narrator, a thinly veiled Jack Kerouac himself as Sal Paradise, and a minor character, Ed Dunkel. What are you going to do with yourself, Ed, I asked. I don't know, he said. I just go along. I dig life. The freedom Kerouac prizes in his classic novel is not the freedom to buy, but the freedom to be. Also beloved by American readers, J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye may have captured the popular imagination more forcefully than any other work in American literature. It is the story of teenage Holden Caulfield, who flees from his private prep school to New York City over the Christmas season in a bid to escape his failings there and his own neuroses. It will be obvious to any of the book's fans how central the theme of anti-consumerism and the dangers of inauthenticity, which he sees as synonymous, are to the work. All of Caulfield's most scathing indictments are reserved for those who have sold their souls for money or social approval. He calls them prostitutes or phonies, ranging from his brother writing screenplays in Hollywood to people who use the adjective grand in conversation. Salinger's obsession with authenticity and integrity and Caulfield's quest for authentic connection and contact with others mirror the concerns of the authors of Affluenza, the impact of consumerism, materialism, and the pressure to conform to an increasingly shallow value system. Finally, perhaps less known, but still important in American literature, Don DeLillo's 1985 novel, White Noise, explicitly tackles consumer culture and advertising-saturated American society in his tale of the main character, Jack Gladney, and his fragmented nuclear family. Perhaps the most direct of any of the works I've discussed today in its attack on consumer culture and Affluenza, White Noise follows Gladney, a professor of Hitler studies, which is supposed to be ironic. Don't go seeking that major anywhere near soon, at a small private liberal arts college. Literary critic John Duvall has observed that the central purpose of this novel is to debunk, quote, the national mythology that tells us we are free, self-reliant, and autonomous citizens when enacted as moments of consumer choice, just as the authors of Affluenza have questioned whether the freedom to buy results in poverty of spirit. This brief tour of consumerism in American literature shows how, even as cultural commentators, sociologists, and pundits of today have been concerned with the negative effects of Affluenza on family life, civic life, and communities, so have some of the most significant works in American literary tradition called our attention to the devastating impact of mistaking consumer choices for freedom. As such, these writers have asked us hard questions about the nature of materialism, the rise of alienation, disconnection, and emptiness in our culture. But how might we as readers respond? And how does this help us think about Affluenza as a phenomenon? Perhaps literature itself. Reading, engaging with these questions, doing the intellectual work of entering into these fictional places that are also real life is the answer to Affluenza. Surprise, I advocate reading. I believe that most of these authors would argue that awareness, consciousness, knowledge itself may be a partial antidote to our cultural ailment. Ralph Waldo Emerson's famous 1837 speech to the Phi Beta Kappa Society, the American scholar, offers an early call to the value of reading literary texts. He wrote, quote, there is then creative reading as well as creative writing. When the mind is braced by labor and invention, the page of whatever book we read becomes luminous with manifold illusion. It is the beauty, complexity, and manifold illusion of literature that may be one tool for counteracting the deadening effects of Affluenza, a vaccine, if you will. Thanks.
Thank you, Holly Hassel. Now we'll hear from Greg Peter.
Good evening, everybody. I'm trying to get the technology to work with me here. All right, we'll see if it'll go. Let's skip that one and move on to the next one here. We're working on a research project in Appleton, talking with high school students about their perceptions of food, nutrition, and health. This all came about basically before the Super Size Me movie came out. How many of you saw Super Size Me, the movie? All right, in that movie, there's an Appleton school that's featured, and one of the things that they wanted to test is whether students have kind of a good breakfast in the morning and healthy food, whether it would have an impact on their day and their learning process, right? It seems like a no-brainer, and certainly the research showed that it did. Now the Appleton Area School District is concerned about what's going to happen in the future, how can we do better, and how can we change not only the elementary school system, but the junior high and the high school. And so they've actually asked us, us being UW-Fox Valley, I'm the only sociologist there, so sociologist, 2 archaeologists from UW-Fox Valley, our students that would be researchers with us, and then we're partnering with Lawrence University, which is in Appleton. UW-Fox is in Menasha, we're about 5 miles from Appleton, so fairly close. and then the Lawrence students that are in anthropology. There's a nutritional anthropologist that's there, and we have partnered and actually sought grants, and we have grants from Community Foundation, Education Foundation, the Milky Family Fund, and also the Appleton Area School District to study high school students' perceptions of food and nutrition. So we did that last year and went into the high school, and I took my Fox students in there, and we got to do research with the high school students to ask them kind of what they thought about what's going on and what's happening, and is it true, right, that some of the food that you eat affects the way that you think, it affects your education and all of that. For the sociologists in the audience, the theory that we're working on is called social structure, and I'll talk more about that as we go through. And there we go. All right. Let me start at the federal level, then we'll go to the state level, then we'll go to the local level. This act was passed in 2004, and so all public schools that receive any kind of federal funding, federal aid for school lunch programs, let's say, have to have some sort of wellness policy, and that started this fall. And so the Wausau Area School District has one and had to follow this wellness policy because of this act, and they have to follow the goals that you have set up there. So they had to have that enacted. It happened in 2004, and then they had to make sure by now, 2006, that you would make it work. Go to the next slide, please. And the next level then, as we're looking at this, would be looking at all of the different organizations that were involved in this process of how can we make sure that the food is healthy, that the school is providing healthy food, but also that the students understand what healthy food is and what being healthy is as you're thinking about physical activity and all of that. So we'll let you look at the list of people that were involved in making that decision and kind of influencing what's happening with the next group. The state policies then are following the federal guidelines, but can be more specific. And I just listed a bunch of the states. You can look this up on the internet if you want. Wisconsin certainly is on that list, and it goes on and on. What Appleton has done is specifically said, these are our criteria. No more than 30% of the total calories from fats, and no more than 10% saturated fat. And what Appleton did, at least at the high school level, is took the soda machines out. Actually, they took the pop out of the soda machines and they put Gatorade in there instead. But that's another further story. But basically, they took the soda out and the candy out from the school stores in all 3 high schools in Appleton, and said, you know, we really need to think about this, and if we're going to do this, we need to kind of, you know, if we're going to walk the walk and talk the talk, we need to be able to do that. So milk, water, and juice are okay, and then they're really seriously thinking about their physical activity and physical education programs and all of that. As we go into the next group here, then we'll look specifically at what we were trying to do. Social structure in sociology, for the non-sociology students out there, is just looking at the patterns of relationships that you have in these different institutions. And so, as the first panelist was talking about some of the influences that the media might have, that was certainly on the list, right, of media and advertising, of influencing the way that you would perceive or think about what's healthy and what's not. We found last year we were in Appleton West, this year we're going into Appleton East, next year we're going into Appleton North, and then we're going to go into the middle schools, and then we're going to go into the elementary schools. So it's going to be this kind of a longitudinal study that we just started last year. As we're doing that, we found the family influence last year to be the strongest influence on the students, on their perceptions of health and nutrition. The school had a lot of influence. One of the things that we were doing with the Fox students is going into the school commons, seeing how many people eat hot lunch, or cold lunch, as they call it here in Wisconsin, right? Hot and cold, or basically what do they buy on the lunch campus versus what do they bring from home. And then we're also seeing in the school stores in Appleton, some of them could sell what you would consider junk food, and others could not. And now they're phasing all of that out because of some of the research that we're doing. Media and advertising had a strong influence, particularly as we were talking about the pouring rights and the vending machines, because they still have vending machines, but they're Gatorade vending machines. And as you know, a lot of the soda companies, pop companies, still make water, right? And they'll bottle water and then they can sell it, and they're still advertising their product that way. We found that athletics really mattered, sports really mattered, being on the team mattered. There was really heavy coach influence there, and we found some interesting things about boys wrestling that I can talk about if you have questions about that, about kind of boys trying to make a certain weight in wrestling and kind of eating and after the competition and all of that. Peers were a really strong influence on friends, and one of the things that we found out is juniors and seniors in this high school in Appleton can go off campus. And so when they go off campus, a lot of times they're going to fast food because it's quick and it's cheap, and that's what they're consuming. The third piece of this that I didn't get to talk about was the archaeologists are actually looking at this. The nutritional anthropologists are looking at the dietary breakdown, right, of what the students eat, and then the fiber content, sodium content, and all of that. So that's the Lawrence students and faculty on that. The archaeologists are actually going in, and we work with them when you go dumpster diving, and you look at the garbage and see what the students ate. Did they throw away the apple? Did they eat all of their lunch? And you have to separate it out, right, from the stuff that is something they brought from home versus the stuff they bought on campus. And then archaeologists, you know, weigh all this stuff and measure all this stuff and label it. And so it's pretty involved. For the sociologists and sociology students here, we're just blending rural sociology with medical sociology, and I'll just throw some terms at you. The globalization of the food system is talked about in Affluenza, so I can get blueberries from the country of Chile and eat them on my oatmeal. That doesn't make any sense as an environmental sociologist, right, and the cost that it takes to do that, but that's actually the way our system is set up. The political economy of what was happening on the school systems, and it may be true in other schools, is it actually costs more to eat healthy when you buy the hot lunch, and it's cheaper to eat unhealthy. So that's a political economy approach then, because if you allow kind of the economic system to run it, then what am I going to want to market? Well, I'm going to want to market stuff, right, so that I'm making more money, yet that students can't afford that, right? So they're going to actually buy what the cheap food is. And so that's a political economy approach. Gastroanomie is something I'm going to talk about at the Wisconsin social meetings tomorrow. It's actually a normlessness with our food system in a sense that you can eat whatever you want. Who cares, right? What are the rules for eating? What are you going to have for lunch? What did you have for supper before you came here if you ate supper, right? There's kind of a normlessness that has come across with that that's not maybe what your parents think or what the school thinks or what nutritionists think. You kind of make decisions on your own. Medicalization and nutritionalization of food, I think they're kind of self-explanatory, but you actually pick things, right, because of maybe the medicinal value in the foods, because it has antioxidants in it and it's going to keep me from getting cancer, right? And that's an interesting thing. And then the nutritional value, right, is I can eat a power bar or a slim fast drink or something and has, you know, just like the astronauts, all the cool stuff in it, right? That's everything that I need, but do you really want to eat that, right? Or would you rather eat something else? All right, and just to finish up, then the next bit that we're doing here is looking at the local food connections. Sociologists call this the connecting to the food shed. So rather than getting the blueberries from Chile, can we get things that are locally grown and seasonally grown? And then shouldn't we integrate that into, we have school gardens and community gardens, and couldn't we integrate all of that into the food system so that students, rather than saying, you know, who grew your supper or who grew your lunch, they can actually say, we did, we know where this came from, we know who the growers are and the farmers and all of that. There's a lot of questions in the Appleton School District about the open campus policy, and I can talk more about that if you have questions. But I'll leave it to our next panelist here. I don't want to take up too much time. So, thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Greg Peter, and now we'll hear from Rita Straub.
Thank you. Here we go. There we go. Okay, thanks for the nice segue, Greg, because you said families have the greatest impact, and that certainly is my part of the program tonight. The things that I want to talk about is really 3 key points. The first one being the impact of affluenza. The second, what can I do about it? We need to recognize that the family is the smallest civilized unit in civilization, the microcosm of society. What really happens in the family has a long, radiating ripple effect. Many times in today's busy society, we want to disregard the influence of the family. As parents and as adults, your behavior is twice as powerful as your verbal or written message. So if you say, do as I say, but not as I do, you've negated that twice. The next part, what can I do about it? I think it's important that we have a toolkit in dealing with affluenza. As adults, we need to be those role models, and it's very important to us. And thirdly, the personal decision. What kind of decision can we make? We've heard all the information about affluenza, but we need to live and do on a daily basis. There's no one out there saying you must do this, but when we look at the power of advertising, it's almost mind-boggling and overwhelming. Families truly are caught up in that epidemic of materialism and overconsumption. And why are we concerned? Because it negatively impacts the next generation. We've certainly been close to it with our situation with the oil and gas prices and various things. It really impacts what happens to the next generation. Plus, we won't have enough for our current generation if we don't cut down on our consumption. Also, how we work and live in the U.S., what we use and what we consume, certainly affects those living in other parts of the world. I had the privilege and opportunity to do some humanitarian work a couple of years ago in Kenya on the continent of Africa. And what amazed me most was I saw people being very, very poor, dirt homes, dirt floors in their homes. But what amazed me when we got to Nairobi, I was amazed at the piles of garbage and trash. And the trash that was flying around were plastic bags. I was just appalled at that. Thirdly, we need to be concerned about those who have not yet been born, our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and generations ahead of us. Also, how do our decisions and our purchasing affect the environment as a whole? We heard about the number of garbage trucks that we could fill from here to the moon, I believe Lisa said. Our garbage is just horrific. If we drive through our neighborhoods, and I happened to notice this today because it was garbage collection in our neighborhood, as I looked up and down our street, young families, those dumpsters, you could not close the lids on those. And ironically, because I'm very sensitive to this, frequently, if we put out our dumpster the night before, the next morning there are items in there that have not come from our household. Families really need to develop basically what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad. That type of conscientiousness in the marketplace is certainly important. Certainly the family impacts, dealing with the mind. Some of my comments that I'm going to make tonight are not opinion, but are research based on some work done by Susan McGregor, a faculty member at the Mount Sacred St. Vincent University in Halifax, Canada, published in the International Journal of Consumer Studies in March of 2006. Families have an inflated sense of entitlement with a decreasing sense of responsibility. And a situation that certainly brings that to home. Recently, I was working with someone who was eligible for every government program in the book. And I was working with this individual on financial management and asked her to bring in her budget and her spending plan for the month. And she quickly informed me that she couldn't bring it in because her child wasn't feeling well, but she would fax it to me immediately. My question was, are you going to leave your sick child at home and go to the corner grocery store or post office and fax this? She said, oh no, I'm going to fax this from my home computer. We need to look at how we use our things in the world. It's reflected across other areas of society. For example, in Florida, there's an abundant need for rental storage units by the retirees who move there. We just have too much stuff. An increase of a lack of commitment and loyalty, but an increased sense of, if I get this job, live in this community or this relationship, if it doesn't work out, I'm out of here. A feeling of self-importance and also a feeling of being privileged. Relative prosperity on the backs of developing countries, such as having our clothing industry and manufacturing move to developing countries so that we can purchase those brand name items at a very reasonable price. By people who are living in substandard housing, substandard living environments, but are providing clothes for things and things that we purchase here in the U.S. Our stress level certainly is time management in families. A few years ago, USDA put out a video nationally, juggling family and work. Those things have just been abounded in recent years because both parents are working to pay all their bills monthly so they can afford the type of car, house, clothing, and of course private lessons for their children. Many health concerns have been known to be related to stress levels. Sleep deprivation is certainly a recent concern for many of us. Overworking. The fully salaried adult individual now who is salaried for an 40-hour work week is actually working approximately 53 hours per week. And some of us seated up here, as well as some in the audience, have probably worked 60 to 70 hours for those salaried work weeks that we expect. No time to be present for the moment. While attending a child's sporting event or a conference, we're thinking about the jobs we need to do when we get home so that we can leave early next morning for that early morning meeting. Oh yes, and we may need to review some of those papers before that meeting tomorrow morning, tonight yet. There's also the growing concern for debt. Consumer debt continues to increase nationally. Bankruptcies have increased fourfold in 1 decade. Just 1 year ago in October in 2005, there was a significant change to our U.S. bankruptcy laws because of the epidemic proportions of personal bankruptcies across the nation. Consumers who file bankruptcy since that change in the law demands greater responsibility for the individual. This includes looking at your gross income, a need for financial counseling, and a money management educational program. Before that law went into effect, there was a huge influx of personal bankruptcies filed prior to October 17th, 2005. So what can I do? The fact that you are here this evening, whether it be a requirement for your class or a personal choice, just the awareness of knowing that we really have an affluenza, overconsumption, and over-materialism going on in our society. Secondly, information abounds. I brought just a few resources here that I have used in recent years. Keeping work simple, keeping life simple. Don't sweat the small stuff. A variety of things that we can use as resources to improve our personal life is certainly important. We can't do everything personally, but we can choose 1 to several changes that we wish to make. There are choices. Refusing to buy an over-the-counter medication that's been overpackaged if you don't need that type of form to carry with you. Having all the pills, all the capsules in one bottle certainly cuts down on the amount of garbage that we add to our environment. Next, the action, making the conscious decision to make a change. Instead of tossing an aluminum can in the trash, look for a recycle bin. Preferably, a drink of water from the faucet would be better. But if you must use that form of beverage, then saving that and recycling it is certainly important. Evaluate how am I doing and how can I manage and learn to live on a more consistent basis and get my family and household involved in doing the same. It really does begin with the family. The process certainly begins with you personally and then translates into your family. But decide what is enough. When do we need to stop? Determine what's important and look back at your family values. More is not necessarily better, and in most cases, more is actually worse for you and your family. Make time for relationships and people, not things and stuff. Plan important activities, and you've heard that tonight from several of us. It's important that we work with people and our families and try and spend quality time with them. We do not need excessive material things. This can be best summarized as the consumer decision can be seen in the terms of personal fulfillment, real happiness, pleasure, and the pursuit of the good life while still having obligations to and respect for others in the context of established norms of what is considered the right thing to do. We certainly can refer to the 4 R's that were very popular in the early 1990s. Reduce the trash that we generate from our daily lives and family lives. Reuse things and do not discard things as soon as they do not work. I know it's very difficult. If you have a toaster, a coffee pot, those are things that are simply built for obsolescence, and this has been going on certainly for decades. Recycle. Think of ways that we can reuse things. In reference back to my trip to Kenya, we had children using these plastic bags that were flying around in the wind, in the trash, rolling them up into balls and wrapping them with string that was lying around. Those became the balls that the children were using to play with. So when we talk about recycling, this was certainly to the ultimate. Also repairing things. Do we drive our cars the extra 5,000 or 10,000 miles, or would we feel that we weren't quite keeping up with the Joneses? We can take the me and turn it into we. As a society, we can certainly make a difference beginning with ourselves and our families. So we really do need to escape from affluenza.
Thank you, Rita Straub, and now we'll hear from John Houchins.
Thank you, Mr. Seal. I generally don't start my presentations with an anecdote, excuse me, but something Professor Straub was talking about, the garbage bags flying around. I've got a friend from Arkansas, which of course is where Walmart is based, and he and his friends used to joke that the state flower of Arkansas was a plastic Walmart bag, the ones with the yellow smiley faces that had blown against the chain link fence. So I thought that was sort of appropriate, not really my style, but still sort of appropriate. I'm going to be kind of building on what my colleagues have talked about, the idea of overconsumption and overspending, and as an economist, looking a little more at the financing of these purchases, which in itself it can be a problem. The overuse of debt, I guess you could call it, in credit cards. I do have some pieces of data that I hope are pretty illuminating to you, pretty shocking, I would think. I found a lot of them pretty startling myself. I'm not going to inundate you with data. I wanted to just briefly go through some of it and then talk about some of the problems this is causing, some of the consequences this has on more important things, look at maybe how the problem is getting a little worse as we go through time, and then end on a more positive note, what kinds of things can be done to try to not necessarily end, but maybe lessen this problem of overusage of credit. Again, some of these numbers I found pretty shocking. 9 credit cards for the average person. Another study I saw said that the average household gets 6 credit card offers per month sent to them. I guess my wife and I are helping bring that number up because I think we get 5 to 10 per week, so apparently some of you are not holding up your end, I suppose. The numbers in the second bullet point are just averages per open card. Make sure you realize that it's not per person, it's per open card. But when you factor in, which isn't on here, but when you factor in that about 75 to 80% of adult Americans have a credit card, again, not all of them are open and often used, there's not too big of a difference between the percentage of Americans that, or the amount of Americans that have a credit card and the total amount of adult Americans in the first place. So. The third one especially I found pretty troubling. The first time, basically since we've been recording it, first time since the Depression of the 30s, Americans on average spent more than they earned. Related to that, an independent credit group found that based on just very reasonable standards, that about 25% of households today should be deemed not creditworthy. Obviously that's not the case because, again, about 80% of households have credit cards, so at least somebody out there is willing to grant them credit. But just some real unscientific reasons, basically ones that came out of the top of my head on the next slide, as to why people charge. I'm sure everybody in here has thought at least one of these at one time. I, of course, haven't myself. Of these, I think probably the third one is rationally at least the easiest to defend. With the growing use of debit cards, however, that's becoming harder and harder to defend. But of course, rational thought maybe kind of goes out the window when you see that beautiful sweater or that table and chairs that would look just great in your dining room. Rational thought maybe isn't quite what we're basing our purchases on. But again, it's no big surprise as to why we charge and why we spend what we maybe know we shouldn't be spending on, or why we buy things that we know we shouldn't be buying. Just a few slides of data here, And notice not so much just the numbers. Again, I think the numbers themselves are pretty shocking. This is per household, over $8,000 of debt on credit card debt. That's just credit cards, it doesn't include home loans, car loans, credit cards. Credit cards, by the definition I'm using, includes not just Visa and MasterCard, but store cards as well, a Kohl's card or a Target card. But of course, the predominant credit cards are the Visas and MasterCards and Discovers. But the store cards do make up a significant percentage too. But notice not just the numbers, but the growth of the numbers. Professor Straub indicated earlier that the rising debt, the rising rate of bankruptcies. Since 1990, I don't have 1990 on there, but from 1990 to 2005, there's been over 165% increase in the average credit card debt per household. Related to that, of course, are bankruptcies that Professor Straub mentioned. Part of that is because, as she said, that the bankruptcy laws have been loosened in the last year or so. But still, significant increases, 30% from 2004 to 2005. At least some of that, probably a significant amount of that, is the need for filing bankruptcy, not just because the laws have been relaxed, but because more people are in that boat, unfortunately. So, one more table of data here, and I think these are fairly self-explanatory. Some pretty high numbers there. As far as some of the consequences, there's a wealth of data out there, and if you have any questions or want to know more information, I mean, there's most of what I've found is from the census data, but otherwise it's from what I believe are reputable sources. Some of the consequences: $1,200 per year in debt. The average debt on a credit card, that's per family, per household. The average interest rate on a credit card is 14.5%. That's well above traditional loans, home loans, car loans, home equity loans. So of the forms of debt, any financial advisor would tell you credit card should be the last form that you use, just because, if nothing else, the interest rates are so much higher. The number one cause of divorce, financial stress, at least one study found that. And then related to that, the most significant predictor of financial stress is when households use credit cards to pay non-discretionary living expenses. Non-discretionary is just sort of the economist's word for necessities. When people are paying rent, groceries, medical bills with credit cards, that's often an indicator of financial stress. And then financial stress is, I think most people would agree, is maybe not necessarily the number one that the study I looked at found, but a key indicator for divorce and other forms of family stress. Related to the interest rate, or the interest figure there, comparing something that's purchased with cash versus the same thing purchased on a credit card, there's about a 12 to 18% difference, meaning compared to $1 that you would spend on something if you paid cash, you'd spend about $1.15 or so after paying it off, after paying interest and service charges and late fees and whatever else. So you're basically spending about 15% more by using a credit card. But remember, couple that, I'm not trying to justify credit cards or anything, but why people do that. I mean, nobody's going to logically, willingly spend 15% more for something. But if it's means waiting till next month when you can pay cash for it, or having it now and enjoying it for that extra month, a lot of people are going to choose the latter. As far as some of the things that are making the problem worse, I mentioned earlier the proliferation of mail-order credit card offers, and again, I don't think that my household is that atypical. I would imagine that most of you, especially those of you that are students even, are getting a lot of that. Obviously, the credit card companies are doing that for a reason. If you're in school, that means you're probably going to earn, you're going to be earning more later, so they want to get you now to start using the credit card and then pay it off later, or even better for them, don't pay it off later and pay them interest. But everybody in Wausau, or I would assume any town of similar size, sees just the payday loan places popping up all over the place. And there's nothing wrong with those businesses. They serve a niche. The niche is intended to be for one-time sort of emergency needs for cash. The problem is with these types of businesses, again, they're perfectly legitimate legal businesses. The problem is the misuse of them that people habitually get into and turn them into not one-time emergency types of loans, but regular sources of cash. And I'm sure everybody's heard the numbers that a 2-week loan where you pay 3%, let's say, for 2 weeks over the course of a year is perhaps triple digits. interest. So, and a lot of people, you know, if you're turning a 2-week loan into a 52-week loan at that same interest rate, it's going to be a lot more than the interest rate that you think you're paying. So, and there's also a disproportionate amount of people that have high credit card debt that are in lower income brackets and are young people. Part of that can be explained by just the traditional life cycle type of hypothesis. People that are younger and have lower incomes, often that's a family that's starting out. They're buying their first home. They're having kids. They're starting a family. They're maybe just out of school. They're fairly young, and fairly in terms of their earnings path. They're going to make more later on down the road. So they're buying things now. They don't want to wait until their mid-40s to maybe buy their first house or to start a family. And so that part would be okay if that's what it was. But there's a lot of evidence that indicates that there's not the traditional churning of people going into and out of this group. It's people that are staying in that lower income group and accumulating the massive amounts of debt. And then it does become a problem. If you're acquiring a lot of debt in your, say, mid-20s, when if it's a kind of a one-time thing, starting a family and buying baby furniture and buying a home and everything, but then tapering that off and paying it off over time, that's not maybe that big a deal. But if it's somebody that is habitually in debt and never getting out of it and spiraling downward, there seems to be more and more of that, not just anecdotally, but the evidence indicates that it's a lot more of that type of borrower that's causing this or leading to the data. Some of the good news that the data maybe kind of masks, I'm kind of pointing out, and believe me, the negative parts of the data far outweigh the good parts. And these, even though they maybe seem kind of good now and kind of promising now, the numbers are generally getting smaller, or the good news is getting less and less good, I guess to say, over time. There is still a lot of households, a significant number, about 40% of households, that either don't have credit cards or don't owe anything on a monthly basis on the credit cards. Again, that number is 40% may sound pretty large, but it's getting smaller over time. 10 years from now, that might be 20 or 30% or lower. But still, for the time being, that's not an insignificant amount. Most people don't, even that have credit cards, open credit cards and run balances, don't owe more than $2,000. The third point, I guess it kind of depends on how you define very few. 10% owing $10,000 or more. The more I think about that, maybe should be under the bad news slide. 10% isn't that small of a number, and to me at least, $10,000 is a very large number. So, and then as I mentioned earlier, the use of debit cards is increasing rapidly, and of course what that means is there is a limit as to how much you can spend. Everybody knows I would hope, knows the difference between a credit card and a debit card. If not, you'll find out the first time you overuse your debit card. So. Just to kind of end on sort of some basic prescriptions, or not, I don't know if I'd call them solutions, but ways to maybe, in accordance with Affluenza, reduce the problem or reduce our need or overuse of credit cards, is to reevaluate priorities. I mean, that's the easiest to say, perhaps, and as the authors of Affluenza point out, it's often the hardest to do, but is that item really needed? And if so, can you wait till you can pay cash for it? When you put that up against human nature and impatience, that's often pretty hard. I mean, this is, like I said, this is a difficult one to do, but do you really need can't the old table and chairs in the dining room work for another few years until you get the raise at work, perhaps. If you have to have credit cards, or if you do have credit cards, get rid of them. Close the accounts. Or perhaps this one would be easy to do, leave it at home. When you go out and you think, well, there's a chance I might buy something, at the mall, leave the credit card at home. If you don't have it, it obviously can't be used. And that one's not that hard to do. That's not going to require really any deep thought on anybody's part, I don't think. You can't turn on the TV without seeing advertisements for debt counseling and consolidation of debt, and for the most part, those are perfectly good ideas. They don't eliminate the problem; they just sort of reduce the problem. I mean, it's not a magic bullet that's going to take care of the debt, and it's more than that's why I put counseling first. It's more than just consolidation. Most of these places promote and advertise and market. It's counseling. It's more than just getting your bills paid off or getting them all in one payment. It's education about the dangers of credit and the downward spiral that can result from that. And lastly, I don't have this on here, but those of you that do have credit cards, which again I would imagine is probably about 80% of us, if you must use them, again, think critically and evaluate before you do, but use the market. This is the economist in me coming out, I guess, the capitalist. Use the market to your advantage. It's a highly competitive industry. So the credit card companies out there are competing for our business, just like other industries. Shop around. Get the one with the lowest rate. Get the one that doesn't have the annual fee. Get the one that's most attractive. There's no reason, there's no excuse for taking a credit card that is less attractive than another credit card. I mean, if you have to use them, do some work and at least use the right one to limit your exposure, to limit, to bring down that $1,200 annual interest payment that the typical household pays. So hopefully I ended on a fairly positive note as far as the usage of credit. But again, I hope the data, shock is maybe a little strong of a word, but I hope that opens some eyes, that not only is the country perhaps in a credit crisis, I would think that most people would agree with, but to try to keep, just on an individual basis, try to keep yourself out of, off of those earlier slides I had up there, I guess.
Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists. Plenty of food for thought. We do have an opportunity now for question and answer period. We have two ambassadors who are just now picking up the microphones from Chris in the booth there, and they will soon be roaming the aisles while you're formulating your thoughts. You're welcome to ask any of our panelists questions. If you're not sure whom to direct it to, you can ask it to me and I'll try to direct it.
I guess I'm directing this to John, although anybody can respond to it. John, you said that as a tip, we might ask, can you put off the purchase until you can pay cash for it? How do you put that in the context of a government that is spending $2 billion a week in Iraq?
$2 million in what? I'm sorry?
$2 billion a week in Iraq.
I can't put that in context, to be honest. Of course, I would, without getting into the politics behind it, but of course I would think we could have waited to do that. But then that does go against what I was just prescribing, of course. So, the answer is I punt. I can't.
Good question.
Would anyone else on the panel like to respond to that question?
Thank you.
Okay, if not, I think there's another question right behind the question we just had.
Thank you. I appreciate the energy that you all have put into developing this community forum and dialogue, because I think it helps me to realize that we're all part, because we're sitting here and what's happened over the last couple of days, the different things that you've done here have shown that there is a new story that people are becoming aware of because of our concern on these issues. And to me, the story that I would like to see developed is we've got to talk about these issues and then come up with an alternative to overconsuming, and to show that it's important for the we versus the I, for the story of empire to go down and create more of a story of a harmony that happens between our beautiful cultures that exist around the world, and we need to celebrate the diversity of different cultures and indigenous people, and all of what the problems are with overconsumption thing is they're driven by this lack of respect and responsibility that our government has been throwing us for 50 years. And I've been working my butt off for teaching to do this. And I'm suddenly realizing that something needs to change. And I would just like to ask you what new stories you think should be kind of developed to counteract this. And I'm thinking of of an article that I picked up out of Yes Magazine a couple of months ago that really turned me from being super depressed about things to being very up. And it was written by David Corton. It's called The Great Turning. And it talked about how groups around the country are starting to get together and talk about issues like this and try to develop a different way of looking at things. And I would just like to throw that out and see how all what you are talking about fits into another alternative. And Lisa, you seem to know what I'm talking about, and maybe Greg does. And
Go ahead.
Looks like Greg and Liz both would like to respond.
Liz, I'm sorry.
Right. We actually had Fran Corton from Yes Magazine come and talk to our staff a few months ago about exactly that piece. This is going to sound a little promo pluggish, but I'll let it. Our organization, the Center for a New American Dream, is exactly that. I was speaking tonight in particular on our kids and commercialism work, but the broader scope of our work, what we talk about is more of what matters. So we talk about more time, more fun, more fairness, as opposed to more goods. And we have things such as our Conscious Consumer website, which directs people to, for instance, outlets where they can buy fair trade products and organic, locally grown. Also, we have message boards for people to talk about, when do you not buy? You have institutions out there now such as FreeCycle, which are growing around the nation. They're much like Craigslist, and it's literally people will find anything from a half-used bottle of perfume to some shelves they took out of their garage and sort of advertise that among their community. Because it's about thinking about the life cycle of the goods that you're purchasing, not just is this good made from 100% post-consumer recycled materials, or is it something that I can stick in the recycling bin when I'm done with it, but the entire life of what happens, how is it produced, how am I going to use it, how long is it going to last me? Is this disposable or is this durable? Is there a more durable option? Is this something that I can borrow from somebody else? I think the situation is hopeful. I think there are a lot of groups out there that are working to address these issues. Did that start to answer? Okay.
Greg, did you want to add?
I'll just give you the short version. It might sound silly, but sociologists believe that every institution that you're part of changes you in some way or has the ability to do that. So family, church, school, politics, where you work, your peers, media, and if there's not one of those institutions that's working for you, you're kind of picking on the government. That's only one of 7 I just said, right? Then create a new institution, right? And that's what you're talking about. That's a sociologist in me, though. That's the way we think.
Can't you change the one you're in, too?
Change it, sure. Well, you influence your family, right? You influence your church. We're influencing the schools that we're part of. The high school students are influencing those schools. We're certainly influencing them. So, but again, that's what sociologists believe. So you don't have to buy that. But, that's what we do.
Another thing you'll find around the country, sorry to reinterject, there are simplicity circles around the country, and if you Google or search on the web for Simplicity Forum, websites will show up, and those are groups of people who meet as a sort of discussion group and talk about all of these issues as well. That's a great resource.
Great. Are there some other questions? Yes, go ahead.
John, I was going to ask you, you posed some statistics on the rate of people filing for bankruptcy since, what was it, like 98 or 95 or something like that? I don't remember exactly what date it was, but and obviously it was steadily increasing. Do you have the age statistics of the number of the people who were filing for bankruptcy?
The age statistics?
Yeah, like what age groups were tended to file for bankruptcy more than others? Or
I don't
did you
have that.
No?
I can find
Okay.
it easily.
I just wanted to know if you had them.
My guess, at least off the cuff, based on the other research, would be that it's a younger and younger population that's filing bankruptcy. But I could find that out.
We have a question in the back there.
Now I'm going to have to bite the hand that feeds me, but we have 4 UW employees, people connected to up there. I'm a parent of a student at one of the UW institutions, which for the sake of protecting it will go unnamed. every quarter I get some marketing scheme to upgrade my kid's meal plan so she can spend her card on the fancier restaurants. And then this final study week, we're supposed to send them gift baskets with Cheetos and I don't know what all. Who's doing this and who do we write to say stop already?
Any panelists like to respond?
I see some head shaking. I think some parents are in the audience.
I guess my suggestion as a parent would be to contact whatever the contact information is to purchase this item for your student and share your feelings. I think we as parents and as families have the responsibility to say enough is enough and we don't feel that this is right. And further, if we're providing Cheetos and things that are not even healthy, I think we're not really working in the areas that we should be. So don't be afraid to speak up.
And Greg?
I just had one comment on that. A lot of the public schools not just in Wisconsin, around the country, are the food vendor. Sorry, it's getting late for me. The food vendor is Aramark, which is a giant kind of corporation, and that corporation actually is willing to bring in the healthy food and organic stuff and maybe work with some of the locally grown things. They're getting the vibe that we're getting from some of these institutions, and they're willing to be flexible about that and willing to change their meal plans. So if that is a concern, then you as parents, you have more influence on the university than we do as university employees, as you know. The parents really could run some of that, and that's something that a lot of the parents in the Appleton School District are kind of pushing the corporation to make some of those changes. So I think you could have some influence on that.
I think I see a hand at the back there.
This question or comment is for Liz. With the budget cuts at schools, I have an elementary child, and I'm trying to start a program over there for her. And the best way I can get money is to get some advertisement to help finance the program. Any comments?
It's difficult. It's a tough catch-22. We deal with that as an organization, for instance, because we don't do direct marketing. So it's very hard for us to build a membership base without every single organization out there. They send you junk mail, and we don't do junk mail. It's really difficult. One of the things I didn't get to is one of the great ways to avoid marketing and consumerism towards children is to support better funding for public schools. Get those ballot measures passed when they come across. Then schools don't have to turn to Coca-Cola or whatever local groups you have to sponsor their new science classroom. I apologize that I don't have an easier answer. I might be able to find out more when I go back to our office. So if you want to see me afterwards, I'd be happy to take your name. And I think there might be some resources from our community where where other parents might have suggestions for you. I don't personally know of any. It's a dilemma.
And there's a question in the back row, I see.
Greg, you said you'd talk a little bit about the wrestling and nutrition.
Oh, yeah, it's an interesting thing when we talk about the sociology of the body, and it's really easy to pick on the women's side of the skinny runway models in the magazines and all of that. But there's also boys and guys that have eating disorders, and so when I talk about this in class with my students, something that I realized as I was in high school, boys wrestlers tend to try to make a certain weight class, and the logic is that I don't want to be the big guy in the little weight class, right? I want to be the big guy in the lower weight class. And so the thing to do would be for me to lose weight to get into the lower class, and then I'm kind of the stronger opponent, although wrestling is actually a technique kind of sport as well. But that's kind of the logic. And so sometimes their students will try to lose weight by spitting into cups or putting on plastic suits to make them sweat, or running a lot, excessive exercise, really controlling everything that they eat, not eating a lot, right, so that they can make that weight class. And then once you do the competition, then you can binge afterwards, right, and have whatever you want until you're ready for the next competition. And so that's just it's sociology of the body, but it fits in with what your perceptions of health and nutrition are, because from a sociological point of view, if the whole wrestling team is doing that, then it's not deviant. It doesn't seem abnormal to you. because that's what everybody does. And if your parents don't say anything about it, and the coaches don't say anything about it, and your friends don't say anything about it, rather they're kind of letting it go or encouraging it, then it would seem that that becomes kind of the norm for that group. And that was really interesting to us, because to flip that, the opportunity then is a really good opportunity for socialization from the coaches to promote healthy, right, lifestyles and eating and all of that, as well as within the family, as well as the friends. And we found kind of the boyfriend-girlfriend thing too in high school would influence this. So thanks for asking. That was really interesting for us, troubling of course, but interesting, and then making us think more about what the opportunities would be for the school system and the parents and the friends to do some sort of intervention when that happens.
Okay, yes.
As a faculty member here and being involved in this discussion of overconsumption, I still have some concerns in that there's large segments of the population that are maybe engaging in overconsumption themselves, but are involved, crushed by, the changes in the economy, working class workers, low-wage workers in the service economy. And many of those individuals, I understand, like bankruptcies, for instance, that approximately half of all bankruptcies are due to, severe medical costs from lack of health insurance or consequences of divorce. So in some respects, I worry that we, are neglecting a focus on what's happened to the economy at large and whole segments that might be left out of this consumption pie because of those larger changes. Can anyone comment?
Well, I think the families that you made mention of is certainly true, and saying that about half of bankruptcies are related to status change, divorce, and also medical expenses is true based on the data that's out there. I think what we need to do is look at the picture in totality, and the more that we consume, the more resources we're using up. For example, thinking of people that have adequate health insurance and those that don't. I've heard people say, well, I have health insurance if I make a trip to the emergency room, and my husband and I were just discussing this because he had just heard a speaker today. The use of emergency rooms, for example, is so overutilized. And I said to him then, did the speaker indicate how many of these were people that had private insurance and how many were people that maybe were on Medicare or medical assistance? And the speaker didn't address that. But many times, because it's there, we go ahead and use it. To me, it doesn't make any sense, because I have homeowners insurance. Do I burn my house down because I think this one's a little too old? And yet when we look at the healthcare side of it, there are some people that overutilize something, and thinking of it in the total context, how does my behavior impact people next to me? And I think we need to look at what's the benefit for all of us, as opposed to this entitlement mentality that we have. The woman that I mentioned, she was going to fax this to me. Well, I pursued the question and said, how could you afford a computer and a fax machine? And she said, well, that was my tax refund. And yet she was way behind on paying her utility bills and her rent. So to me, I think we need to put this in perspective as to what are our necessities, and then the overuse, the consumption, and what impact that has on the broader population. So I don't have any black and white answer, but I think each and every one of us, it behooves us to think of, what does my behavior have? What does the impact of my behavior have on the rest of society and culture as a whole?
I think we have one more question.
I want to thank you all for coming. I liked your presentations. I thought they were all different in addressing the same question. Greg, I want to congratulate you. One of the biggest problems, I do think, is the health issues, and especially in the schools. And it looks like you're really doing something about that and making the kids aware of it too. And I think this subject of affluenza might really be great to address this in high schools and elementary schools, because these are the students we're trying to get them to think about their lives. And also, if you remember when the idea came out about no smoking, a lot of times they taught these things in elementary schools, and the children went home and said to their parents, I want you to quit, I want you to live. So perhaps that would be a good way for us to take this news into our schools on the lower levels, as well as the high schools, or the colleges, and as well as the community. And perhaps that would be a way to get this message across. Thank you all very much. I really, really appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
I think this might be a good time to thank all of you for coming tonight and to invite you to the terrace room. I'd also like to remind you that this is a year-long dialogue between the community and the campus. There will be 5 more events. In addition, we do have our online dialogue. I'd like to invite you to join it, and you can again go to the campus website and find a link. One of the questions is, what do you consider a necessity and what do you consider a luxury? I think that is a wonderful note that Rita has left us with that we can think about. Thank you all again very much.